Welcome to DivCasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Leon Festinger. I teach theological ethics here, and I'm also the director of the Martin Marty Center for the Advanced Study of Religion. Every year, the center is privileged to have what we call senior fellows. That's not an age designation, it's an expertise designation, who join us in the Junior Fellows Seminar, contribute to the life of the Junior Fellows, and also give one of these lectures to showcase the work they're doing. We're gathered today to hear Professor Betty Beyer, who's Professor of Women's Studies at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and has been a Senior Fellow this year. Betty's been a real contributor. I'm sure all of you who are the Junior Fellows can easily attest to this. The lecture we're going to hear today is entitled Endings Without End, When Prophecy Fails and the Rise of New Age Spirituality and Cognitive Dissonance. The format will be very simple. Betty will give her lecture, open questions for a while afterwards, and then we're going to retire for a bit of a reception afterwards, so please stay on. With that, let's welcome Professor Beyer.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill, and thanks to all of you who came out. I know that it's nearing quarter's end and time is precious, so I welcome everyone who's here. I'd like to begin with some thanks to the Martin Marty Center, especially to its director, Bill Schweiker, but also to Lucy Pick, for a year that has been most reinvigorating. Often we get stuck in our own tracks and we think we're rummaging around and reframing our ideas or our classes, but in fact it really is something like the Martin Marty Center that reinvigorates our thinking, renews our energy, and prompts us to have new doubts, which is a good thing. I'd like also to thank very much the Junior Fellows in the seminar. I have learned an immense amount from all of you, and how constructive your feedback is to one another. And I have had to get unstuck and rush to the library to figure out who are these figures they're talking about, which has also been a welcome moment for me. So just a couple of other thanks. I'd like to thank Julia Woods, who's always there and always supportive. So thank you. Keeps everything running. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Kelsey Crick, who's been working with me as a research assistant and whose questions about the project have proved invaluable. And my colleague at my home institution, Mae Farnsworth, and Crick. And then there's always one's own personal thanks to their partners. And I'd like to thank Susan Henke, who has lived out the ups, downs, the turnarounds, and the back-againings of this project. She has been a key interlocutor in many ways. I should probably also give a nod to Mary Gerhardt, who was on our second floor at Hobart and William Smith. And had I not had an office on that floor with religious studies and me, women's studies, it's quite possible some of the questions I've asked in this project would not have arisen for me. So I do want to say thanks to both of them, and especially to Susan, who I work in the area of history and theory in psychology. Susan works in the area of history of religious studies, sociology of religious studies. I crossed the floor and decided one day that this project really had a lot to do with religious studies, and how was I going to bring that together. So I wanted to thank her also, because rarely does one have a partner and colleague, but then also a colleague who is your partner, who becomes so gracious and generous in sharing resources and pushing you and telling you when you are asking all the wrong questions. With that, let me begin. Eventually I'll get to who she is. It may seem rather unconventional to begin a talk on a note of endings, but when one's talk is prophecies, especially failed prophecies, one finds oneself without usual recourse to beginnings. A bit of a spoiler, to be sure, to begin with the closing act. No surprise, no moment of anticipation. Or is there? When I tell someone I am undertaking a history of Festinger, Reicken, and Schachter's 1956 social psychology book, When Prophecy Fails, their replies often run counter to expectation. Recently, one went something like this. So, how did things pan out? I paused, wondering if they were asking me in that nod, wink sort of way, suggesting perhaps some failure on my part to recognize the title's tell-all, When Prophecy Fails. In my hesitation, however, they leaned in to ask me the same question again, as if I hadn't heard them, as if I'd failed to grasp the question. In that gap lies a crucial distinction. What they well may be inquiring into has less to do with endings or beginnings of the end, and more with what the story revealed. This distinction is pivotal for two reasons. For one, we live in a culture saturated by end-time discourse, perhaps even more than at the time of the study in mid-50s America, a time culturally attuned by systems of surveillance, secrecy, and the doomsday clock poised for a second year at 2 minutes to midnight, a time when people were said to want their religion to be a little more psychological, and when the psychological was being wrought through cybernetics to be a little more cognitive. Just days before the prophecy'd end, a Chicago Daily News headline deemed, quote, prophetess Dorothy Martin, who's on the slide, of Oak Park, Illinois, and who, after the book came out, was referred to in the book by her pseudonym. They called her Marion Keach. The Chicago Daily News referred to her as, quote, calm on Cataclysm Eve, December 20th, 1954. Her colleague, Dr. Charles Lawhead, called Dr. Armstrong in the book, was also described as calm, despite having been fired from Michigan State College's health staff for his, quote, end-of-the-world teachings. Claiming his group was not a cult or religious sect, Lawhead noted that a small group met, and I quote, under the auspices of the People Church of East Lansing, and were known as the Quest Group, who discussed saucers, philosophy, ancient mysticism, and the, quote, atomic war that disturbed saucer men, the unbalancing of the universe. Just weeks before, the Chicago Sun-Times ran the story, Tidal Wave Reactions, surveying what Chicagoans would do if they believed Martin's prediction of the city being, quote, washed away by a tidal wave. Most surveyed, and I quote the paper, seemed unconcerned, unrattled. Some of those asked indicated they would advance and enlarge the New Year's Eve celebration into a real flame. Others told the Sun-Times they wouldn't change any plans. 4 days before the prophecy'd end by flood, a Chicago Daily News headline read, "End to the world is near. It's an old cry in history." It is an old cry in history, but is it the same old cry? Today, one senses end-time talk has become rather banal, punctuating everyday discourse as if we are at a loss for descriptors of severe or bothersome conditions, and so we add the suffix apocalypse to all manner of things. This winter, snowpocalypse, wordpocalypse, words that need to be wiped out from everyday talk, zombie apocalypse, a little overkill if you ask me, and endless media reports of it's the end of the world as we know it. Use of the word apocalypse shows steady increase in books from the 1950s on, spiking, not surprisingly, between 1990 and 2012. All of which brings me to the second reason. Maybe my interlocutors are conveying how never-ending indications of apocalypse to render social, cultural, political, economic, environmental, and all assorted catastrophe cataclysmic are now not only unbelievable, but also unlikely. One senses in their questions a more cosmic horizon of inquiry. Is that all there is? The end? And to what larger worlds might a world's ending point? In the end, they may be attuned to how endings extend themselves out to frontiers of subjective and objective worlds, to matters of consciousness and human existence, a hearkening to what a prophetic apocalypse reveals about worlds beyond or other than endings, invoking in the quest apocalypse's etymological meaning, to uncover, to disclose, to reveal. It may not all have been for naught, then, that Leon Festinger came to call the psychological phenomenon arising from that December's night of failed prophecy cognitive dissonance. For dissonance, drawing on ideas from musical dissonance, as this psychological concept does, may be said to connote foreshadowing and revelation. Early 20th century composers and artists used dissonance in new ways and to new effect, with some claiming their new age of dissonance foretold tonality or consonance's collapse. Likening dissonant composition to streams of consciousness, expressing the inner spiritual necessity of an age, or giving voice to inner turmoil, dissonance resonated with the early centuries' clamor of war, fragmentation, and chaos. If the modern subject could come to hear what at first may seem as inharmonious sounds, or compositions as having a form of harmony, then, or so the thinking seemed to go, might this new dissonance also signal the end of a form of ordering the world, an end to psychological and social certainties? Whether of mythic proportion or not, one cannot escape how dissonance came to be both sign and practice of psychic and social life in early 20th century Western music, social theory, literature, and the arts. Few deny dissonance's grip on imagining the modern subject, its tones of meaning beating through and through with those of spirituality, including theosophy, even as questions remain as to what extent this moment's fascination with dissonance, with sound and psyche, proved a shift changer in the modern subject. Equally the case is the hold of Festinger's 1950s rendition of dissonance as cognitive dissonance on academic and popular discourse. So much so, in fact, our age is said to ring with like signs and acoustic symptoms of cognitive dissonance. Still, what's it all about, you may well ask, for isn't dissonance's early 20th century challenge to tonality coincident with expanding consciousness of inner worlds, to experiment with its expressive forms, to give an ear, as some put it, to the psyche's double step of anguish and joy, or as others said, to compose a spiritual philosophy of multicultural utopia or a reconciliation of science and mysticism? And isn't mid-20th century cognitive dissonance with Festinger's focus on persistence of beliefs in the face of evidence to the contrary, such as end-time prophecies, about making sense of how humans appear counterintuitive to a rational calculus of the mind, a more conservative idea? True, one could imagine the earlier moment as an opening to wonder, and the later post-tonal one, as some called it, as given over to a rationalization or intellectualization of the counterintuitive, a closing of wonder. Such a narrative would make of the history of cognitive dissonance but one more element in that larger and well-rehearsed plotline of the Western world's continuing secularization. It would also leave unexamined that implicit twin dissociation of psychology and secularity, and of one calling out the other. That is, an implied two-way causal relation of becoming more psychological and more secular. This historical plotline and this set of assumptions is precisely the historical and conceptual knot my research seeks to tease apart, to grant a new hearing to the paradigmatic when prophecy fails and the theory of cognitive dissonance. To listen again is to attend to this history's discordant notes. How was it that the same century in which we become more psychological and secular was also the same century in which we became more spiritual? How did the transit from religion or New Age spiritual prophecy to cognitive dissonance become in the end a matter of psychological rather than spiritual or religious tension? That is, the measure of rationality cognitive dissonance was envisioned to instance relied first on Martin's New Age prophecy, one the authors connected to other religious veiled prophecies, and second on abjuring the religious or spiritual in the theory of cognitive dissonance itself. In a curious way, though, as this reflection will show, the spiritual acoustic unconscious returns, manifesting as a form of irrationality. This repudiation of occurrence is good reminder of the forgotten rudiments in the story of Narcissus. His quote, refusal to hear, echoes invocations of love. Here, a discipline replays its history, unable to hear, in its questions, concepts, and theories, neighboring resonances made to sound all too far afield. But what transpires, one wonders, in that moment of turning the extraordinary powers of prophecy into ordinary irrationality, or madness, a practice embedded in an ontology, and I quote, guaranteeing that all are in principle explicable. No wonder there, we are led to ask what the nature of cognitive dissonance's relation to religion and spirituality is, and what implications this has had in its psychological conversion to cognitive renditions of the mind, religion, and spirituality. From another angle, this question asks, what goes missing from consciousness and effective life when a discipline, such as psychology, bases its study on spirituality as an already determined other, on which to set the terms of its concept or theory, and then eschews this other on the grounds of its irrationality or madness. What happens to understandings of the psyche, of religious experience? To urge the question along, what, if anything, goes missing or ends? What other worlds of meaning and ways of understanding ourselves, the mind, reason, and rationality were surrendered in this century of uncertainty, with its theme of endings without end, of tensions between worlds before and after, wrought through two pinnacle moments of dissonance? These questions form the larger arc of my history of when prophecy fails and cognitive dissonance. It is an arc that extends to wonders at disciplinary partings of the way that nonetheless return, such as those of religion and spirituality and psychological science, furnished anew in novel psychological terms. This is not a history of the psychology of religion, or of the religion of psychology, or of the science of religion or of psychology. Rather, it is a history of how science, religion, and psychology aid one another along, the tangle of their relations. It is a history that finds itself incomplete without the arc of William James's treatment of consciousness and varieties of religious experience, through to his astute rendering of medical materialities or reductionism. And here I quote James, a sad discordancy marks medical materialism's measure of moments of, quote, sentimental and mystical experience, as of genius and as signs of disease alike. Medical materialism, he continues, and I quote, finishes up St. Paul by calling his vision on the road to Damascus a discharging lesion of the occipital cortex, he being epileptic. It snuffs out St. Teresa as an hysteric. Philosopher Isabel Stenger's drawing on James also inquires into how, quote, a being of faith, the Blessed Virgin, for example, becomes turned into matters of what exists and what does not, categorically and symbolically, thereby failing to consider the Virgin Mary's own particular force or effects. Historian of religion Lee Eric Schmidt addresses how a, quote, psychological shift in perspective functioned to silence or to turn into sensory illusions, and I quote him, a numinous angel, the rustling leaves that became whispering voices, the statue that came to life. Whereas Schmidt's history attends to a disenchantment of an acoustic unconscious, of a loss of acoustic consciousness in religion, Anne Harrington's history of science of mind cures attends to that productive conjunction of science and knowledge at the level of embodiment. Not only does she observe how understandings of hypnosis changed over time, but that, quote, the mental and physiological experience of hypnosis, what it is, underwent change too, and in ways that clearly reflect changing social expectations and mores. One is struck by the profound relationships these authors uncover that run as deep as the language of fragmented and multi-level consciousness by which we hear who we are and imagine the world in which we live. They reveal an arc of mores, James' mediating term for how there is, quote, actually and literally more life in our total soul than we are at any one time aware of. And it stretches out this more to encompass the networks operating amongst science, religion, spirituality, and psychology, despite their assumed divisions. An examination of when prophecy fails requires, indeed illumines, these larger and longer concerns. Today I address them through two close-up moments, the night of the failed prophecy and the emergence of psychology's cognitive dissonance, and a recent use of the book and its theory in contemporary debate on the new natural theology and cognition. But first an excursus, for in my work dissonance operates not only as the object of investigation, but also as an opening into rethinking how we carry out historical scholarship. Histories such as these examining the disenchantment of the ear, the force of apparitions or symbols to set in motion pilgrimages and piety or changes in the body at the level of embodied senses are thorny by their very nature and through deeply worn groups of inquiry and understanding. This project proves no different. For my attention to spirituality, especially New Age spirituality, inevitably prompts questions about the psychological status of the prophets or the group members, including whether there are signs of or information on whether Dorothy Martin, who was threatened, here's one of them together, with psychiatric treatment, had epileptic seizures, a traumatic childhood, suffered from auditory hallucinations. Well, you get the picture. Similar questions arise regarding Charles Lockett, who underwent a court-ordered psychiatric examination in light of charges of mental incompetency filed by his sister. In undertaking these histories, one wrestles with the twin horns of the dilemma. Either someone is mad, or their beliefs are mad. Either the psyche has gone astray, or the spiritual and religious beliefs have run amok. To steer clear of such well-trodden ground means holding in tension various contrary parts to raise new questions about psychology, science, religion, and spirituality, and to move discussion beyond iterations of believers in or redeemers of either this small millennial group or of the research social psychologists. Such histories compel their own unique historiographical needs, I would argue, ones that break with extant frameworks, much as dissonance of the 20th century sought to do. So here I borrow from 20th century use of dissonance in music and variations on this use as an experimental tool in conceiving of and investigating human nature and the cosmos. If dissonance instructs historiography, which I think it does, it may be reformulated, as well as its kin relations, history of science and science studies, along lines proposed by Y.G. Dimmock in her literary theory of resonance, to give a new, quote, profile to the concepts of historicity and context. She sounded a challenge to time and place-bound notions of historicity, obliging words and texts to stay within and become contained by particular times and places, rather than examine their extensions in time and place. Two additional theorists amplify. Arnold Schoenberg, composer, painter, theorist, and key figure of the new emancipation of dissonance, as he phrased it, writes of dissonance as stirring unrest, and I quote, "A state of unrest is placed in question through a contrast. From this unrest, emotion proceeds." He elaborates. "The primitive ear hears the tone as irreducible, but physics recognizes it to be complex. In the meantime, however, musicians discovered that it is capable of continuation, that is, that movement is latent within it, that problems are concealed in it, problems that clash with one another, that the tone lives and seeks to propagate itself." Schoenberg's theory of dissonance resonates with certain features of William James's multiverse, which he described as the, quote, strung along type, the type of continuity, contiguity, or concatenation. Here, too, discord is operative in one phenomenon's contrary relation with another that conceals all its, and I'm quoting him, all its religious effect upon the mind. Beauty and hideousness, love and cruelty, life and death keep house together in indissoluble partnership. James's multiverse collects within its analytic frame extensions in time, proximity as a principle of association, and relations through change they create. Schoenberg underscores movement that lies latent in resonance. Things travel through time, things affect one another in their transit. Sometimes their resonances sound a new depth of meaning, sometimes heard out of time, and sometimes heard as a clash of symbols, concepts, and texts, what Dimmock calls a, quote, timely unwieldiness. This unwieldiness pays homage to, quote, time both as a medium of unrecoverable meaning and as a medium of new possible meanings, bringing resonance into play with dissonance to rethink reception histories. How do we trace the trajectory of echoes from the past, their cosmic occurrences, as we find in questions of dissonance and prophecy? Put more simply, how do we put our ear to the past? What kicked off Festinger's dissonance research was a problem one might describe as just this kind of trouble with trying to put one's ear to the ground. This is the vexing problem of felt resonances in communication. One might hear something, a message, news, prophecy, or communication of some sort, but that tells you little about how it will be received or shared with others. To begin to map communication flow, one had to think through those invisible networks of social relations and influence, through what Festinger called the psychological environment. Communications resonated. They had a momentum of their own, could set other things in motion, were unpredictable in their effects, and often had manifest or latent within them emotions, motives, desires, and longing. What intrigued Festinger were not those consonances where information, behavior, and the psychological environment fell into neatly constellated harmonies. His questions were more in tune with the dissonant times of mid-20th century America's tensions and turmoil around rumors, secrets, and political transgressions. Rumors, such as those associated with communist propaganda, for example, took on a life of their own, creating or sustaining psychological environments with little grounding in fact. The number of contingencies in any effort to chart such psychological environments seemed astronomical. However daunting the task, 4 institutions, the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, Harvard University, Sociology, Columbia University's Bureau of Applied Social Research, and University of Minnesota's Laboratory for Research in Social Relations were brought together by the Ford Foundation to inventory the status of knowledge within the fields of social stratification, child development, socialization, political behavior, and social communication and social influence. The aim of these inventories was to determine the status of knowledge on what influences human conduct. Festinger's field of expertise was social communication and social influence, and he formed, as did each expert at the other three institutions, a team of researchers to work together over several years to complete the inventory. Planning proposals detailed a vast and wide swath of literature to be reviewed in the humanities and social sciences, from Aristotle to Marx, Weber and Durkheim to Park, Parsons, Homans, and from Freud to Allport, Sharif, and Ash, to name a few. Works under study in Festinger's group, composed of a philosopher, sociologist, and later social psychologist, covered a vast range of disciplines, from American studies to history and to literature, and from political science to public opinion psychology, including John Hershey's Hiroshima, Bruno Bettelheim's Rumors and Communications in Concentration Camps, Henry Smith's The Virgin Land, The American West as Symbol and Myth, Hadley Cantrill's Invasion from Mars, a study in the psychology of panic, and Claire Endicott Sears' Days of Delusion, which is a book on the Millerites. Events of interest range from disasters, disease, catastrophes, and prisoner of war camps through to military, troops, lynchings, mass poisonings, interracial tensions, and so on. Their inventory began to be shaped by anxiety-provoking versus anxiety-reducing rumors and fears, how beliefs were justified, and any disjuncture between the, quote, reality of the situation and your picture of the environment. As early as 1952, Festinger specified that, and I quote, dissonance or consonance is not between the behavior and psychological environment, but between or among parts of the psychological environment. Of more interest, then, were the resonances of social communication, how the over and undertones reverberating amongst persons, joy, sorrow, feelings of loss, anger, fear, and anxiety, had a sort of agency in cognition, social, psychological environment. Just as dissonant tones altered the sound of music following them, or some have argued modern interiority, so the reverberations of social communication, its feeling structure, was vital to what and how people made sense of things and responded. Of the innumerable works in inventory, three held Festinger's and his research team's interest from the start. One was an anthropology dissertation on rumors in Japanese relocation centers, done here actually in the sociology department. A second was a study following rumors after the great 1934 earthquake in Bihar, India. Arguably, though, it was lay historian Claire Endicott Sears' aforementioned work, Days of Delusion, a strange bit of history, that would become foundational to dissonance theory. Sears placed a notice in many leading newspapers around 1920 calling for recollections of the, quote, great religious excitement in 1843, the year that William Miller predicted the end of the world. She drew on others describing the broader psychology of this historical moment as a, quote, remarkable agitation of the mind. The year 1843, she writes, and I quote her, was also a year of great revival among the Shakers, all discovering mediumistic powers within themselves and continuously conversing with those long dead and with prophets, martyrs, and scriptural characters. Emerson, she writes, captured the feel of things in his description of a, quote, convention of friends of universal reform. And here I quote him. If the assembly was disorderly, it was picturesque. Mad men, mad women, men with beards, dumpers, Muggletonians, come-outers, groaners, agrarians, Seventh-day Baptists, Quakers, abolitionists, Calvinists, Unitarians, and philosophers. All came successively to the top. Described in different ways, this old New Age, as Lee Eric Schmidt refers to it, may be understood as central to the story of modern interiority. A history that, for some, meant moving away from, and I quote Schmidt, religions of authority into the new religion of the spirit. There is a felt resonance between this earlier moment described by Sears in the 1950s, during which time the dilemmas of the day were said to be written, quote, soul-sized. Insofar as social psychology pursued the mind's rational calculus, a corresponding religio-spiritual inward quest sought to find reason in, and I quote Ellwood here, the universal primordial wisdom of humankind, now secreted away in the arcane language of myth and symbol. Both, however, arose during Cold War America, and both seemed acclimated to the age's notions of balance, consistency, and contiguity. Just as David Reisman was lamenting Americans' lack of inward direction, Norman Vincent Peale was expounding a psycho-spiritual power from within. Was the populace simply driven by outer forces, or was there an equally strong inward direction? Theorists differed, but what Festinger sought to detect was the field of information as one circulating medium of tensions amongst cognitions, propelling people to resolve their dissonance. By late summer of 1954, Festinger, having been joined now by Stanley Schachter and Henry Reicken, had a good handle on what he saw as the contingencies and conditions of dissonance and consonance. What he was missing was a psychological environment in which to test them. How he longed, recalled Reicken in an interview, for some historical event, something comparable to the Millerites, to give dissonance theory its test. Then, as luck would have it, on a routine morning, checking the stock market pages in the newspaper, Schachter came across the story of Dorothy Martin's prophecy in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune on September 24, 1954. The headline read, "Head for the Ark, folks. Word from space says floods due." This story had been picked up from the Chicago Daily News on September 23rd. It remains a mystery, however, as to how or why the Chicago Daily News reported the story or the Minneapolis Star-Tribune picked it up. But they did. And Dorothy Martin, born in West Virginia in 1900, moving from there to Chicago by way of New York, became headline and sometimes front-page news in local and national newspapers over the next 5 months. She had been a registered member of the Theosophy Society for at least 1 year, was most interested in Theosophist Alice Bailey's writing, and had a long-standing interest in outer and inner space herself, including channeled communications. By one account, her first religious vision came following her prayers for pain relief during treatment in Waterloo, Canada, for lymphatic cancer. Prior to this, she'd had a vision on the night her father died while she was hospitalized from serious injuries incurred in a car accident. Subsequently, she began to receive messages from her father. Elsewhere, Dorothy Martin recalls having had, quote, extrasensory perceptions from a young age, seeking out around 1940. The spiritual teacher, Paramhansa Yogananda, founder of Self-Realization Fellowship. In the first story, publicly announcing her prophecy, Dorothy Martin recounts her prophecy from Planet as one of 6 months of communiques channeled to her from beings from afar, furnished with a photograph, and this is the photograph, that is Dorothy Martin channeling, of her pen poised the story, clarion call to city, flee that flood, relayed how it all began one Easter Sunday morning when, while lying in bed on the sun porch of her home, Dorothy Martin's arm began to feel warm and she felt an urge to write. She then just, quote, put a pencil to paper and wrote, filling her notebook with channeled messages, what she called lessons from her teachers, including the prophecy of a flood to arrive on the winter solstice 1954. With this prophecy's disconfirmation, Dorothy Martin received a message deferring this end's arrival to Christmas Eve. Sing your songs of the season, instructed the message channeled to Dorothy Martin from outer space, and faithful may join us. So directed Dorothy Martin, her main associates, the Lawhead family, and this is in Dorothy Martin's house in Oak Park, and a number of other unidentified group members gathered together in front of her home. The group broke into song at 5:55 p.m. 6 o'clock came and went without a sign of the anticipated Mars spaceship rapture. They continued to sing. Still no sign. At 6:35, Dorothy Martin and her followers stopped singing. Where her group had filled this evening's air with voices of anticipation, a kind of hush fell over the night the kind of quiet wonder incredulity summons. Who could believe the spaceship would not show? Who could believe it would? From September to the new year, and unbeknownst to Dorothy Martin and Charles Lawhead, they were the subjects of social psychological study. Festinger, Schachter, and Reicken had joined the group as undercover participant observers, and they had hired and orchestrated a number of graduate students from Michigan and Chicago to also don disguise and join the group. 2 undercover sociology graduate student researchers were in East Lansing, one of whom babysat for the Lawheads when they visited Oak Park. At least 2 undercover graduate students were from the University of Chicago in sociology, and by my archival and interview research, I've calculated that at least 2 other undercover graduate students were involved. Nor were these subjects aware of the book about to be published on their lives during this time, and they could not have had an inkling of how the book, the theory, and their lives would come to be defined by and to define a moment both within social psychology and within New Age spiritual and religious movements. This is a slide taken by a very well-known photographer for the Daily News. It was never published in the newspaper, which is interesting. I don't know why I held that back. This photograph of the Night of Failed Prophecy summons us to revisit the beginnings and endings of a study carried out under secrecy and the lives whose stories, under fictive names, it narrates. For surely this night, as the book, theory, and the New Age movement came to have a new hold on the American psyche, its popular discourse, and ensuing debates on religious experience, psychology, and science. Magnifying this prophetic drama as one of unknown worlds is the photographer's use of light and shadow, creating a cosmic umbra and the eclipse of one world by another. Onlookers see one world, Dorothy Martin's, only to wonder about others. No one could have predicted the endless ribbon that would unwind from this study. Virtually every academic discipline has drawn on it. The book was fictionalized in 1967 by Alison Lurie in the novel Imaginary Friends to elucidate the tangle of objective observers and subjects in participant observer studies, and then her novel was adapted for a BBC television drama. A proposal was made to turn the study into a musical in the early 1960s. I don't know. I saw the correspondence. And in the year 2000, Darcy Sankey, a descendant of William Miller's family, published her short story, The Early Timer, drawing directly on When Prophecy Fails. Other readers use the book as a field guide to their own personal experiences of religion. The resonance has become more far-flung over the decades. Today, metal bands take their names from the title of the book or the theory. Adbusters magazine, if you know Adbusters, claims cognitive dissonance as its activist tool to disrupt ordinary consumer consciousness, kind of Marxian intervention. A recent podcast claims this term to flag its mission of religious deconversion stories, and psychology offers a test of cognitive dissonance as if it is a state of being. The term cognitive dissonance peppers conversation every day, suggesting a kind of cultural currency conveying interior experience. My personal favorite was when someone, who does not know my research area, told me her daughter was experiencing a double cognitive dissonance, as if the term was self-explanatory. If indeed we may claim cognitive dissonance as a commonplace of discourse today, and if it is not a conceit to say it signifies predicaments in contemporary life, then surely its resonance across academic and popular fields invites another hearing. Considered one of the most well-established, enduring, and generative theories in social psychology, cognitive dissonance has enjoyed a parallel longevity in religious, millennialism, and cognitive religious studies. These fields' respective patterns of citations reveal an age-old discord. Psychological research most often cites Festinger's subsequent 1957 book, A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, while religion, theology, and religious studies citations as New Age spirituality more often expressly cite, discuss, and retest the book When Prophecy Fails. Titles such as When Festinger Fails, When Prophecy Never Fails, When Prophecy Fails Again, and so on. The most recent Oxford Handbook of Millennialism, for example, opens with Festinger's study and theory as framing the field paradigmatically. These two paths of citation use indicate a division between the fields in historical emphases on epistemology over ontology. A partition resounded as well in discussions of relations among science, psychology, and religion. To catch the resonance across these deployments is to detect at one and the same time Festinger's interest in the persistence of belief as a question about the persistence of religious belief, an undertone made palpable by his lengthy preface of religious traditions and their failed prophecies. Historians of scientific psychology did not miss a certain irony to cognitive dissonance's first associations with persistence in religious beliefs, while eclipsing the case of science, suggesting religion's pursuit as something other than sciences of knowledge. Edward Boring, in mid-20th century, for example, put on record, and I quote him, 7 instances of occasions on which the scientist proceeds in the face of cognitive dissonance. But he directs his record to how cognitive dissonance may make the investigator, quote, more effective by pushing the contradictions aside and his going on with whatever business he has in hand. Others, such as Solomon Asch in his 1957 review of the theory of cognitive dissonance, direct attention to the book's and the theory's reductive treatments of discord by titling his review Cacophonophobia, a fear of jarring sound, signaling a larger mis-dissonance in this moment of heightened surveillance and conformity. Most recently, and forming the second kind of reception history, which I noted beforehand, is Barbara Herrnstein-Smith's use. She brings both the book When Prophecy Fails and the theory to bear on science and religion today, especially some cognitive science and evolutionary theory, whose works naturalize notions of the mind in religion and religious experience. On the one hand are science's efforts, largely anthropologists and psychologists, to debunk religious experience as a cognitive illusion or persistence of belief, what she terms the new naturalist view of cognition in the study of religion. I have edited this out and I can't resist it. Just a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times on Sunday, there was an article, and it was called, "Is That Jesus in Your Toast?" And it was yet another instance of trying to sort of take a moment and claim that it was some sort of cognitive priming that leads you to see Jesus in your toast, or Mary in your pancake, or however it goes. But anyways, the whole thing is sort of was about how cognitive science can remove and explain to you these sorts of illusions, and illusions that may arise during crisis, but we don't know why some illusions arise and not others. On the other hand, Herrnstein-Smith finds a strand of work seeking to square scientific accounts and religious beliefs of the natural world with arguments of their overlap, what she deems the new natural theology. These two intellectual projects, she argues, mirror one another in any number of ways, including their persistence of belief and their lexical conceptual knot of the natural versus supernatural. One senses Herrnstein-Smith's interest lies mostly with particular forms of science-religion debate, where either side surrenders to what she calls, quote, cognitive conservatism, a persistence of belief that closes off ways to understand and pursue science and or religion. Her interest circles back primarily to matters of epistemology. She therefore leaves unaddressed how science, religion, and psychology have more broadly worked hand in hand to naturalize certain understandings of cognition as of the rational and as of the religious and spiritual. Their entanglements may also foreshorten perspectives on cognitive forms by looking more and more to interior worlds, creating a form of cognitive reductionism akin to the troublesome medical materialism identified by William James. One can hear this as well in recent indications of cognitive dissonance in the new neurotheology, claims of a frontal cortex becoming rather lit up in atheists when asked to meditate on God, and I quote, "It was almost like you were seeing cognitive dissonance. That is, the brain being asked to focus on something one has trouble with, and it sets off all kinds of emotional alarms." Whether cognitive dissonance is invoked as a phenomenon to evidence beliefs or struggles with them, whether of religion or of science, and whether it is moved into new domains of cognitive mapping, such as those performed by neuroscience and neurotheology, what is overlooked first is how these fields' interrelations continue to define and delimit notions of cognition, science, psychology, religion, and spirituality. And second, how these limited notions come to have a force of their own. Jerome Bruner offered some insight into this current dilemma at the Symposium inaugurating psychology's mid-20th century turn to cognition. He offered Festinger's, quote, conception of consonance and dissonance is in a fine and ancient tradition. It is the psychology of Aesop. He continues, and I quote him, "I respect the concepts of consonance and dissonance the more for their ancient origin. But," he reflects, "if, quote, one dips further into folklore and literature, one soon finds cases to the contrary, violations of consonance-dissonance theory, like," and here he quotes two lines from poetry, "we look before and after, and long for what is not." His concern with scales of time here is about rhythmic patterns, history, and cosmic recurrence, of how the smaller story of cognitive dissonance evokes larger and deeper ones. Bruner gestures then toward a reductionism in Festinger's theory in larger disciplines' formulation of cognition, as one of foreshortening time and contracting meaning to algorithmic input-output renditions instead of humanity's search for meaning, a longing understood in that multiverse sense of strung along types or endings without ends. In this, Bruner points to another 1950s matter of affair, psychology at the nexus of science and the humanities, a concern heightened by C.P. Snow's article on that relation in the mid-1950s, known now by its shorthand, Two Cultures. Snow was concerned too with possible closure of worlds, those lifelines running between the humanities and sciences. So the recurrence toward which Bruner invites a re-envisioning, at least as I hear him, is twofold. There is the cosmic recurrence. Dissonance and consonance echo across the ages, reminding of us of an intimate history between making new music and new knowledge, of the technologies of the one lending themselves to new openings of understanding the structure of the universe, and of the, quote, hidden and mysterious universe within us. The question of cognitive dissonance as of cognition is thus larger than supposed by its initial formulation and current metamorphoses of it as an inner state or particular spot in the brain. And there is the recurrence of relations among science, psychology, religion, and spirituality, one surfacing most recently with repeated reference to C.P. Snow's Two Cultures. Ernestine Smith directs her book toward this very debate, and others, such as Roger Luckhurst, include this debate's earlier 19th century iteration. Qualifying the two cultures with the phrase, or the end of the world as we know it, Luckhurst signals his focus on science and culture wars. Still, each attends to the importance of revisiting interchange amongst science and religion. Here we must add psychology. For as this history of when prophecy fails and cognitive dissonance argues, its interrelation with science and religion is a constitutive one, generating all kinds of worlds, from those of inner tensions to brain activity, and activist tools to measures of psychological balance, order, and certainty. One reviewer of Alison Lurie's fictionalization of When Prophecy Fails depicted the story of a tragic comedy of the modern intellect. To pursue this history into the modern subject is indeed, then, to sound the double step of a dissonant tone, the kind intended to stir up new hearings of old compositions, to hear anew the constituent relations among science, religion, psychology, and spirituality in that longer pursuit of asking, what does it mean to be human? What's it all about? Thank you.
We have time for questions. Can I let you field them yourself, or do you want
Yeah,
me to?
that's fine. Please.
Paul, so maybe a question of clarification. So, you characterize the 20th century as the century of anxiety, but the 1990 to 2012 maybe is a peak of this use of apocalyptic language. Mm-hmm. So do you see this kind of anxiety continuing to build? I mean, the anxiety that produced this?
Well, I think the idea of discord has become much more pervasive and talk about discord. But I'm not sure that people attach to the idea of endings the same ways of understanding that would have been there, say, in the 1950s or in the late 19th century. But I do think that there's a kind of way in which all the environmental uses of apocalypse and so on just kind of drained some of the meaning out of it. But certainly the idea of discord and the way in which cognitive dissonance is being used, it's kind of blasé as well. It's not as if you're being stirred up by some inner tension. When people talk about it, they're talking about it in the sense of a kind of, I'm just sort of at odds with myself. I have a cognitive dissonance.
Right.
And so, it is interesting to think about how psychological terms move out of, scientific labs and so on and take on a life of their own. But they can also, in that sort of movement, come to stand for very different things, right? And they prompt us to think about ourselves differently. So, I mean, I don't know if you listen to stuff about the, polar vortex and the snowpocalypse and so on and so forth.
Yeah, right.
So, and it may be that, environmentalists aren't as effective as they might be if they just shed the language of catastrophe and, found another discourse in which to talk. I think, my main interest is in the science, religion, psychology debate right now, and how cognitive dissonance plays a huge role in that, and the sort of narrowed down notion of cognition. But thanks. Yeah.
Parts of your talk reminded me of Alex Owen's book, The Place of Enchantment.
Yeah.
So her argument that theosophy and the Golden Dawn movement at the turn of the 19th to 20th century were exploring avant-garde themes of the self and the self as a place of exploration, which was simultaneously a point of focus for psychologists, psychoanalysts, and so on. Do you see something similar going on in the 50s with cybernetics and cognitive psychology and so on, where there's a kind of avant-garde shift as far as cultural interests are concerned, or is the anxiety more of a kind of popular sort of middle class kind of phenomenon? I mean, it seems like with Alex Owen, it seems like that it's more of an elite kind of thing, not so much of a middle class.
Right. Whereas Dorothy Martin doesn't really belong to the elite New Age spiritualists, although she is recognized in books, if you look up new religious movements or new spiritual age or whatever, but not in the same sense as some others. That could possibly be because of the Reicken and stuff. First, one part of your question about Alex Owen's work. Her work is really important because what she's showing is in that moment, new terms emerged that we use today to understand ourselves. So terms such as consciousness, the subliminal conscious came out of James's studies of mediums as well, right? So that there's a whole way in our psychology isn't just being awakened, it's actually being transformed, which was why I mentioned Anne Harrington's work, because what she noticed in the archives was that you don't just track how hypnosis was taken up or used at one moment. You start to hear people describe their inner embodied experiences in different terms. They're experiencing it. So Alex Owen is important for that. The second part of your question about the age of anxiety, there are many competing notions about the 1950s. And there are some things that I'm debating about in Festinger's archives. His papers are not consistent and coherent whole, to be sure. But there was a way in which the Ford Foundation was interested in these vast areas of knowledge and what they could distill from that to inform people about what influences human conduct. There's a corollary to that, which you can just pick up faint traces of in the papers. They're also funded at the same time, and they're sort of being asked to talk about ideology and conversions of beliefs. And that's about the international concerns. That's about prisoners, right, of war. So there are different ways in which this work branches out. But you're sort of, how general was it? I think Jerome Bruner really taps into something at that cognitive symposium, that psychology was looking to become more scientific. I mean, that was its goal all along in some ways. Bruner eventually becomes, as you probably know, a narrative psychologist, right? But there's this moment where cybernetics and the question of information, could we really sort of shift away from Freudian psychoanalysis and behaviorism? And those two things are also happening in that same moment. Festinger makes mention at times that this energy inside, this tension from dissonance, could be something that moves you. And so that you wouldn't have to explore things in the same way that Freud did. So it's an ego moment. But I think it's very interesting that Reisman sees it as sort of like everything's a mess in America, we're just a bunch of conformers. And then there's Norman Vincent Peale who's saying we're just finding the power within to direct ourselves. So I don't know if that yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the talk. It was lovely. Want to see if I, in a sense, have understood it, and if so, pose a couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I really like the idea of the notion of a psychological atmosphere, that one is trying to, trying to trace the various influences of both of a particular period and in terms of the flow of social communication at the level of disciplines and at the level of popular culture.
Right.
So you're zeroing in and looking at that atmosphere, which is again a way to break out of a Freudian.
Exactly. Yeah.
So then the two questions become immediately, it seems to me. First, why did you choose prophecy as a key, the hermeneutical key into the social psychology of that particular period? And secondly, is there a way in which when new concepts are created, they also are driven by an impulse of what we might call self-banalization?
Yes. Yes.
In other words, they give you an insight into a moment, but then oddly enough, we in religious studies see this is what happens in religious discourse, right? It's constantly self-analyzing itself. So I was wondering why prophecy, and if you're also interested in the way in which new concepts come to be, we understand ourselves in a different way, but then all of a sudden you have someone talking about double cognitive dissonance, in which it becomes a very banal.
Double espresso.
Yeah.
Okay. So, that's what I heard. Okay. So
Is this making sense?
absolutely, and that's a wonderful summary. Yes. The first question on prophecy. Why do I use it as a keyword? When I began this project, I really wanted to just figure out who were these people and what happened to them when they had been studied, and they did discover. It's not like they didn't read the book. Okay, Dorothy Martin had that book in her bookshelf to the day she died. And one of Lawhead's children, who's of course retired now, so she's in her 60s, but she sent me an email. They do not want to be interviewed. They destroyed all of his papers and everything. So we have no idea. Here's somebody who, was a missionary, was very active in the church and so on, and had a crisis of faith, one would argue, and tried to make sense of that. So when I first started, I just really wanted to know who are these people and what happened to them. Because this study was also considered one about ethics, right? Not to mention the big theory of cognitive dissonance. But the more I started to read it and think about it, the more I started to realize that and I'm grappling with this, that so much of psychology seems to begin from a premise that it has nothing to do with religion or spirituality. And yet there are these very different moments, like the one that question highlighted about mediums and so on and so forth. There are many different moments where psychology relies on that, and so its concepts, its terms, actually come from that experience in part. So I started to think about that, and then there's the very long introduction to the book. And is that just plopped in there because he thought readers would want to read about other failed prophecies? He could have had that preface cover a number of different topics. So it suggests that he was puzzling through something else there. And it forced me to start to grapple with the parts of the history that I was less comfortable with. One of them being prophecy. Now, the second part to that is, I work in history of psychology, and prophecy is a term about histories. Predictions are often seen as a more specific term about forecasts. And there is, in that moment, that challenge between, and Popper wrote about this, the difference between the term prophecy and the term prediction, right? And I think that that's also something to think about. For people who work in critical history, as I do, we think of ourselves as humans, as historical subjects. And so for us, a term such as prophecy, noting histories, and so, depending on how you interpret it, may be more relevant than ideas on specific ideas on prediction. If that makes sense. Second part, new concepts. Yes. Neurosis, neurotics, depressives, all of that sort of stuff. And it does ask us to think about different questions when we're studying works. And I think that's, you want to get the sort of cultural currency of something, but that can't lead your investigation. But you have to ask yourself, what made it catch on in some way? And so, yes, it drains it of meaning. But on the other hand, people like to self-describe, and they use psychology as one way to do that. But yeah, I think religion is probably as many of the same problems. I don't know if sociology does. People who work in sociology of knowledge or sociology, if they encounter that. I mean, I don't know if sociology, if people in sociology, anthropology does it, in terms of
I think of a concept like charisma.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton is charismatic.
Right.
Has very little to do with, or is far removed from, Bavarian notions of charisma, of a certain type of authority.
Or notions of ritual and writes how they've sort of been, changed. But anyways, thanks, Phil. Any other
Yeah,
questions?
thank you.
Yes?
I have a question that it never occurred to me before until I heard it in this context, because there was somebody at your talk forum that asked a question about Chicago. So I became very aware of the multiple references to Chicago in this, right? There's Oak Park, there's the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences Doomsday Clock, there's the University of Chicago Social Thought and Sociology departments. So I'm just, so I'm actually just curious if you think that there's some reason that is, and a tidal wave from Lake Michigan. Is there a kind of sense in which this is a particular instance of a, and I happen to have heard other versions of this talk, so I will say, you also talked about, in other times, the race riots in Chicago, and just because I happen to have just read Third Coast, right, there's jazz and other kinds of music happening here that are about this. And there's the guy who becomes Sun Ra hearing from flying saucers. So is there something?
And there were actually a number of, Adamski and I think some others came to Chicago and talked about their works about having experienced space aliens through Chicago. So,
is it about Chicago somehow? I know it sounds silly, but I never.
No, it's a great question. And I wrestled with that. I was like, oh my gosh, because one of the things, and Kelsey knows how we have worked on this a lot, how did she get here? There are just these great gaps. And I've interviewed distant members of her family who don't seem to have a lot of story, or maybe they're not willing to disclose it because, their lives were detailed in a way, and that the story of madness reigned in it, rather than was there something dissonant in kind of these different spiritualities. What were they trying to work out? And one could have written the story of dissonance on that, right? But to show the inner turmoil and to sort of reduce it in the way that it was tells a very different story. So I don't know, Susan, if there was something about Chicago, the University of Chicago, was it just all fortuitous? I mean, I think about Stanley Schachter getting up, and there's something about that. He's going to check the stock market and get the prophecy in the newspaper instead that he can use for his research. So, but there, I don't know about the area. Certainly the logistics were quite remarkable for this study. They had to coordinate with graduate students in Michigan and the University of Chicago. Ed Schiltz was in the Committee of Social Thought at that time, and so a lot of his memos were involved. But his papers are closed for decades to come. Anyone knows why? And the file of transcripts from, because the way that they worked when they went into her home, they, the participant observers, and this has always been a question, how many were there? Like, how many were there really in the group? And how many were actually undercover researchers? That's always been one of the questions. But they would, go to the bathroom, I guess, and take notes or whatever, and then they would go back to wherever, and they would read their observations into tape recorders. And at the end of the book, it says there's hundreds of hours of tape recorded observations. There was a closed file until 2025, I think, at the University of Michigan in the archives, with transcripts in it. Now, you would assume that would be quite a box of transcripts. It's sealed, but it's thin. So I have no idea what's in there, whether it's just maybe the participants' names, which are now known, or what. And Henry Reicken was not, he didn't disclose too much, a little bit. He wrote and published a piece after about being an undercover, or what it means to do undercover research. So, I don't know why this book has the hold it does in religious studies, but it does.
A question about breakdowns. A couple of times there's been a reference of breaking out of Freudian framework, and the moment that you're situating this group and then Festinger and social psychology, I mean, clearly follows on the heels of the Frankfurt School spending time in exile in New York and producing a massive study of social prejudice and of social psychology, being funded in by various institutions. And I was wondering whether this study, Prophecy Fails, had an explicit desire to distance itself from the models being developed by the Frankfurt School of the authoritarian personality as the way of explaining what was going on in the late 20th century. And, Adorno's writing on...
Who uses dissonance a lot.
Clearly, was thoughtful about listening to music, and also writing on things like, why do people read horoscopes in the early times, or thinking about this question of prediction, prophecy, perhaps, the distinction you're getting at. So, I don't know if that's clear, but to what extent were they seeking to distinguish themselves from the Freudian and therefore the Frankfurt School sort of models? What was at stake there?
It's a great question. I've been wrestling with that, Susan. I was sort of trying to track citations right into my advisor who studied with John Thibault, and Festinger had wanted Thibault to be part of the team, and sort of trying to piece some of it together through their references, which I cannot track that through Festinger. I can track it through some of his references to wanting to have a model to supplant Freud's, or he didn't say it that way, but this would be a different way of thinking. You didn't have to go to psychoanalysis. He is himself a scientist. He's a chess player. He really loves cybernetic stuff. The information move, the decision-making models, and so on. His master's and his PhD clearly indicate that type of thinking. Okay, and I think this moment fit with that. And he wanted to make his place, and he did. He was accomplishing a couple of things. But he always said he was trained as a child psychologist. He was never trained as a social psychologist. And then after he did this, he leaves the field. And he actually ends up, I found one letter, is that from Porcupine? Is that what I said? Accepting him into a religious studies department. And he starts to write on the human legacy and some sort of more archaeological, anthropological type work. So it's hard to figure out because his papers are haphazard and the thinking isn't mapped up that clearly. I think he was very interested in the psychological environment. He was a Kurt Levine student, the Stalin. And a lot of them who had fled from Europe to the US. And so that is absolutely part of it. And he was heavily influenced by Kurt Levine. They were very, very close. And I think that was a very traumatic moment for him. Kurt Levine passed away at a younger age. And Schachter ends up running human relations lab for a while. So I do think that's part of it. Can you document it so clearly? Not so much. And I went back to Kurt Levine's work, because when he comes up, Durkheim comes up, and I thought there's got to be something going on here, because they are looking at structures, they're looking at different parts. But couldn't find it directly. But I think there's something there, and it may be through their different schools of thought. Harvard was Parsons, Bales.
Mead here. George Herbert Mead here.
That's where the achievement theory starts to come out and those sorts of things. So, but then he leaves this. This theory has carried on, and Festinger really only did a little bit of his. We look and we're like, oh my gosh, psychology's like, never mind the theory book. We'll just draw on the study, And so all of a sudden, by the 60s or the 70s, they're sort of drawing more on one research study than actually looking at his theory. And I think there's a lot there about his methodology too. As doing feminist history and psychology, I've had to reflect on my own work and say that I was fundamentally mistaken about some claims I made years ago about this kind of research. Because I think they were really trying to create situations that were more dramatic and psychologically evocative. than just what was described in the 1970s as finding days in the laboratory, chemistry and so on. So I don't know if that helps, but thanks. Any ideas you have, I would welcome.
I spoke to make motion.
Okay, thank you very much.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.